I'm going to do something, I think, a little bit different than what you've seen so far. So I'm going to take you through work that we've done in building a large-scale brain model, and then hopefully, getting to my last few slides, think about what that means for the future and how this relates to other technologies. So the model that we built is called Spaun. It's the world's largest functional brain model, or it was in 2012 when we first proposed it. It showed up in two places. One was chapter 7 of this book I wrote called How to Build a Brain that came out with Oxford, and the other place was in Science. It got lots of press, which was great, and at the time, it had about 2.5 million neurons, 7.5 billion connections, which was a lot in 2012, right? Bigger than most neural networks. And it did a lot of sort of modeling of neuroscience, so it had the right variety of neurotransmitters. We tried to match both the physiology and the anatomy. And one of the key things is that it was functional, right? So it was a brain model that actually did something, which is not all that common, surprisingly, you might think. At the time, we had 8 different tasks that we were looking at. And what I'm going to talk about today is mostly what we did 6 years after that, which we call Spaun 2.0. So here's an example of the model running. It's performing a task where it's comparing the categories that images are coming from. So there it saw 2 monkeys. So it wrote a 1 saying, yep, that was the same category. So it's looking at these different images and then writing down what it sees. This is an experiment that you can run on humans in exactly the same way. Now it's just writing out the class of digit that it sees. And it's got the same input and output. So the input is something projected on screen. The output is movement of a physically modeled arm. So it's actually generating torques and muscles in order to move the arm and so on. But of course, unlike a human, we can look at every detail that we want about this behavior, how this behavior is generated. So here's an example of what's going on in the primary visual cortex. And there you can see a bunch of spikes that are being generated in the model. And then on top, we're saying, well, how would we decode those spikes? That's not enough to actually perform this task. You have to remember what you saw. And so we also have areas which are doing things like working memory. And of course, you have to change what you remember you saw into a motor plan, which will then actually let you drive your arm through the pattern that replicates what you saw. And so we also have a motor system. But of course, this is a fairly low-level task, right? This is something that, from a machine learning perspective, is fairly simple. We're kind of doing MNIST at this point. But we can, with the same exact model, do much more complicated tasks. So here's a cognitive task. So your job is to figure out what goes in that box at the end. And we've built up, this same model is doing the kind of reasoning that you're doing. I'll presume you've never seen this particular task before. This is patterned after an intelligence test that tests fluid intelligence called Raven's progressive matrices. And you're looking across all this data and trying to infer a pattern and figuring out how you'd complete that pattern. So when our model does this, it's doing the same kind of thing, right? It's never seen this before. It hasn't memorized this particular set of inputs. It can't move its eye around, so we're showing the data in a slightly different format, but it's the same sort of structure. And it's sitting there and basically doing inference to the best explanation, right? So once I get at the end, what would I do in order to complete the pattern? And so, like you, it will write out 3 5s, right? Saying that would be the correct way to complete this pattern. So what we like about that is this shows that the same techniques and model can do low-level stuff, but it can also do cognitive stuff. And we also like to point out this is a brain model, so we can take data. Here it's doing a task that I haven't shown you, which is a bandit task, and we can compare the dynamics of the spikes generated by the model to the dynamics of spikes recorded from a rodent in the same part of the brain, right, in the ventral striatum, both the model and the real one, and then we can look at the dynamics and see are they the same or different and go from there. But we can also do this at a behavioral level, so we can show a whole bunch of images, different numbers of numbers that people and the model will memorize and repeat back. And you can look at patterns in working memory. You can see what are known as primacy and recency effects in psychology, where you have really good memory of the beginning and at the end of the list, and sort of the quality of your memory gets worse in the middle, and so on. And we can go to fairly low levels of detail. So in this model, the model in the front we call Spaun Plus, because what we've done is we've taken a lot of the very simple neurons in Spaun and we've replaced them with very complicated neuron models, so we can actually look at the effects of changing ions. In this case, we're applying a drug called TTX, which is a sodium channel blocker, to the model in the front, and we can see how does it perform this working memory task. And you can see it remembers the information, and then it starts writing out its answer, but it stops. And the reason it stops is shown by the red box, where it's kind of all fuzzy in there, and it means it hasn't forgotten, because we can see the 432, but it doesn't remember what it was doing. Right? So part of the model is keeping track of what task it's in, and that's the thing that you disrupted when you injected this sodium channel blocker. So what I like about this example, you'd never ethically do this experiment to a human, right? But now we have a really clear mechanistic hypothesis about what the relationship between this low-level, molecular intervention and a high-level cognitive effect could plausibly be. So the other thing that actually, I guess one thing I should mention about Spaun 2.0 is it has about 6 million neurons and 20 billion connections. And so when it came out, it was really at the scale of large language models at the time. And what we'd like to do, of course, is to keep growing the size of the model, but now we're running into computational constraints and so on. But Spaun 3.0, basically, now's the time, right? We've waited the right length of time. One of the other things that we do with these Spaun models is looking at how do you coordinate all of the control in the brain to be able to do many different tasks in the same substrate. So the exact same model with no changes to it can do all of these tasks. You just tell it which task scenario it's in, and then it will perform the task given the right inputs. So, in Spaun 2.0, we now have 12 tasks as opposed to 8. And you'll notice that the very last one there is instruction following. And of course, that's a very general task that can do, for which you can do many different things. And I sometimes like to call this mental gymnastics. So I'm going to give you a little example of what I mean. So imagine the letter V, capital V, and then imagine a capital B, rotate it 90 degrees counterclockwise, put it on top of the V, and then erase the back of the B. What shape do you have? Heart, see? So some people followed along. I threw it at you pretty quick. Yeah, heart or a double scooped ice cream cone is the other one you often get. So what you were doing there is basically, imagining things, you're generating representations in your head, you were manipulating those and so on. So in the instruction following, right, we're doing the same kind of thing with the Spaun model here. So this is also pretty hard to follow, but at the beginning, we're saying, okay, find a pattern, and we're going to show you some digits. This is just like that Ravens matrix. So if 3 follows 1, 4 follows 2, what was the pattern? Is that it's increasing by 2. Now do question answering, right? Here's 3 digits, what was in the second position, and it wrote out a 7. Now we're going to apply the pattern that we found to that list, which means add the pattern to the list. So it's writing out 6, 9, and 4. So it's added 2 to the pattern you showed it. And then we're saying, okay, apply the pattern to the position that you found. What do you get? 2 plus 2 is 4. Right, so it's doing the same kind of thing that you were doing at that point in time. All right, so now I get to the slides I wanted to get to, which is thinking about the relationship of this to other technologies. So, what we're doing here is integrating neuroscience and cognitive science with using computational theory. So this has a lot of implications for neuromorphics, and in fact, our techniques have been used to program pretty much every neuromorphic chip that's available right now. And there's, trying to scale neuromorphics to the point where it can run a full Spaun model, I think is a huge challenge. So right now, none of those systems are very capable of doing that. Looking at things like neural prosthetics, of course, is relevant because we have an understanding of the neural code, how information is encoded and transmitted. And our techniques have also been used to do things like neural prosthetics, so far just in monkeys. Thinking about AI as a process, which is not what LLMs are, right? So this is thinking about them changing over time, interacting with constantly changing environments and so on. This is very different than the sort of standard techniques people tend to use in AI. Less so with reinforcement learning, but definitely things like LLMs. But that's exactly what we've done here, and this is exactly how biological cognition functions. And then last, discovering new algorithms. So I had this great conversation over lunch about a new algorithm that we've discovered using these techniques, which outperforms transformers by a fairly significant margin. And I think there's a lot more to be discovered than that, and I'm happy to talk to people more about that bold claim later on. And then the future. So I think over the next 5 years, a lot more of this AI and brain model cross-fertilization should happen. So we see it it's happened quite efficiently and effectively in vision research. And it's just starting now in language research, so understanding the brain's role in language as well, using some of the techniques of large language models. A lot more of that can happen. Beginning to see really the first broad commercial applications of some of this kind of technology. Then 10 years out, looking at things like, can we embody these large brain models, right? So we get up to, trillions of synapses, billions of neurons, and being able to put those in robots, which are running on, small amounts of power, ideally. So I think doing that is kind of taking the technical route. And then the other thing we want to do is take the more health-oriented route, where we would want to do something like digital twinning, right? So where you can scan a person or an animal and be able to tune all of the parameters in the model such that now when we run the model, it's actually acting like that particular individual. And I will stop there. Thanks.
Thank you.